There was a time when a console error did not give you a helpful QR code, a support page, or a cheerful little button marked "Try Again." It gave you a black screen, a cryptic number, or a burst of electronic noise that sounded like your television had opened a portal to hell. You were 9 years old, the room was dark, and suddenly the machine you trusted was speaking in a language you were never supposed to understand. But here is the strange part. Some of the most terrifying console error screens people remember were not caused by broken hardware at all. Some were warnings, some were security systems, and some never actually existed. We will come back to that, because the internet has rewritten this history in a wonderfully creepy way. In the 1970s, consoles barely had enough intelligence to fail politely. The Atari 2600 launched in 1977 with just 128 bytes of RAM and an 8-bit 6507 CPU, not kilobytes, bytes. Its custom television interface adapter, or TIA, performed the kind of work later associated with a VDP, generating graphics and sound almost line by line as the television beam crossed the screen. There was no operating system waiting backstage, no graphical user interface, and certainly no customer support menu. If a cartridge made poor contact, the CPU could execute garbage instructions while the video hardware painted rolling lines, corrupted colors, or a screen full of visual noise. But that primitive failure had its own atmosphere. The game did not tell you what was wrong, so your imagination did the work. You pulled out the cartridge, blew into it, wiped the metal contacts on your shirt, and tried again. Yes, blowing into cartridges was officially a terrible idea because moisture could corrode the contacts, but every kid became a Nintendo-certified Win technician anyway. Arcade machines were slightly more talkative because operators needed diagnostic information. Cabinet might boot into a RAM test, show a ROM checksum failure, or freeze on a grid of hexadecimal numbers. But players were not meant to see that world. The moment you saw ROM error or bad RAM on an arcade monitor, the illusion disappeared. Pac-Man was no longer a hungry yellow hero. He was software running through a CPU and video circuitry on aging boards beside a carpet that smelled faintly of soda and regret. Home consoles changed that relationship because they lived with us. So when Nintendo launched the NES in North America in 1985, failure became personal. The NES used an 8-bit Ryko CPU alongside its picture processing unit, Nintendo's specialized video chip. But hidden inside the console was another piece of silicon, the 10NES lockout chip, a custom security ASIC designed to prevent unauthorized cartridges from running. A chip inside the console communicated with a matching chip inside the game, but dirty or misaligned contacts could interrupt that handshake. So the console reset itself roughly once every second. The result was the legendary blinking power light. The screen flashed, the television clicked, the game appeared for half a second, vanished, and came back scrambled. It was not technically an error screen, but it became one of the most recognizable failure states in gaming history. Nintendo had built a security ASIC to protect the platform, but that same system punished millions of legitimate owners because one tiny contact was dirty. That matters because it established a pattern we will see again. Console errors were rarely scary because of what they said. They were scary because they interrupted a familiar ritual. You knew the sound of the NES starting. You knew how Super Mario Bros. Looked. So when the ritual broke, the machine suddenly felt wrong. Sega understood theatrical presentation better than almost anyone. The Genesis launched in North America in 1989 with its famous blast processing attitude, a 16-bit Motorola 68000 CPU, a secondary Z80, and a VDP capable of pushing colorful sprites across the screen. The bit count mattered because this was the era when 8-bit and 16-bit were not merely technical descriptions. They were tribal identities printed in giant letters on boxes. Blast processing was mostly marketing wizardry wearing sunglasses, but the Genesis hardware was real, fast, and wonderfully direct. It had no full operating system producing elaborate universal errors, so most failures came from cartridges, add-ons, or individual games. The Sega CD changed that. Released in North America in 1992, it brought another CPU, extra RAM, a BIOS, a boot animation, system menus, and the possibility of messages telling you that the disc was unsuitable. Suddenly, the console had a voice. Suddenly, it could reject you. Disk-based systems made errors more dramatic because loading was now part of the experience. A cartridge either connected or it did not, but a CD spun, clicked, slowed down, sped up, and made the laser assembly perform a tiny mechanical exorcism. You could hear the machine struggling, but Sony turned that struggle into theater. 9 MHz MIPS CPU with 2 MB of main RAM, dedicated video hardware, and custom chips built to throw textured polygons around at a speed that felt impossible in 1994. Those numbers sound adorable now, but the presentation felt impossibly futuristic. You pressed the power button, the screen filled with white light, and that deep startup sound rolled through the room. Sony Computer Entertainment. The logo appeared. But if the console could not recognize the disc, that sacred sequence changed. Depending on the hardware revision and region, you might land in the system menu or receive a stark message asking you to insert a PlayStation format disc. The colors were wrong. The music was absent. The console was still alive, but the game world had refused to open. I remember that feeling more clearly than some actual games. You would stare at the disc as if it had betrayed you personally. One scratch, barely visible under a lamp, could turn an evening of Final Fantasy VII into an archaeological investigation involving toothpaste, soft cloths, and advice from a cousin who absolutely did not know what he was doing. The PlayStation also blurred the line between machine and mood. Its memory card manager floated in an empty digital space. Its CD player transformed music into shifting patterns, so even normal menus felt slightly alien. When something failed inside that environment, it did not feel like a simple technical problem. It felt like you had reached a hidden room behind the CPU, RAM, BIOS, and graphics silicon. A room the player was never meant to enter. Nintendo moved in the opposite direction with the Nintendo 64 in 1996. The machine generally booted straight from the cartridge, so if it failed, you often received nothing. No explanation, no apology, just blackness. Was the cartridge dirty? Was the jumper pack loose? Had the CPU stopped receiving valid code? Had the reality display processor failed to produce a video signal? Good luck, detective. But developers sometimes added their own protection. Rare used anti-piracy checks in games such as Banjo-Tooie, while other companies created failures that looked like ordinary glitches. That was more effective than a warning because pirates could spend days debugging a broken copy without realizing the game itself was fighting back. The most vicious example came from Earthbound on the Super Nintendo. Pirated copies could trigger an absurd number of enemy encounters, making the game miserable to play. But if someone somehow pushed through to the final battle, the game could freeze, reset, and erase the save data. That is not an error message. That is psychological warfare in a colorful little cartridge. Sony escalated everything with the PlayStation 2, released in Japan on March 4, 2000. Its Emotion Engine CPU and graphics synthesizer arrived during a period when bit count marketing was reaching absurd levels. Sony called the Emotion Engine a 128-bit processor. But that number did not describe the whole machine in the simple way 16-bit had described the Genesis era. By then, custom ASICs, vector units, memory bandwidth, and specialized graphics pipelines mattered far more than one heroic number on the box. The machine became the best-selling console ever, moving more than 160 million units according to Sony's updated figure. But millions of players remember something far less comforting than its success. The red screen of death. If the PS2 could not recognize a valid PlayStation or PlayStation 2 disc, the peaceful blue menu was replaced by a red tunnel of twisting shapes. A low, hostile sound filled the room, and white text instructed you to insert a PlayStation or PlayStation 2 format disc. Technically, it was often not a death screen at all. The console might be perfectly healthy. You could trigger it with the wrong disc format, a damaged game, or a failed read, but Sony presented rejection like the arrival of an ancient demon. Why red? Why the distorted architecture? Why did inserting a DVD from the wrong region make the console react as if you had shown it forbidden scripture? Because by 2000, boot sequences had become part of the brand. Sony wanted the valid game disc to feel authentic, protected, and special. So the invalid state had to feel unmistakably wrong. The horror was not accidental, even if the memes came later. The GameCube, launched in 2001, was less theatrical but somehow more unsettling. Its common error message appeared as plain white text on black. An error has occurred, turn the power off, and check the instruction booklet. No swirling red vortex, no monstrous sound, just the cold confidence of a machine that had ended the conversation. The original Xbox, also released in 2001, went further into technician territory. Beneath the giant plastic shell was a familiar x86-style CPU, an NVIDIA graphics processor, a hard drive, and a collection of custom controller silicon. A failed boot could produce a multilingual service screen with an error number in the corner. Codes like 05, 06, 07, 13, or 16 became infamous in the modding community. One could mean an unlocked hard drive. Another could indicate a drive timeout. Error 16 could appear when the console could not set its internal clock because essential dashboard files were missing. That is beautifully specific and completely useless to a 12-year-old. But the Xbox 360 transformed console failure into a global symbol. Released in 2005, it used 4 lights around the power button to communicate status. When 3 quadrants turned red, you had the red ring of death. There was no haunted background and no threatening paragraph. Just 3 red lights. But those lights meant your console might be finished. Heat, board flex, solder problems, and repeated thermal stress around its CPU and graphics ASIC contributed to widespread hardware failures. In July 2007, Microsoft announced a warranty extension and recorded a charge of more than $1 billion related to repairs and coverage. So the fear was no longer imaginary. Players wrapped consoles in towels, blasted them with heat, watched repair tutorials, and prayed over machines containing hundreds of hours of memories. The red ring became more famous than many Xbox games because it represented something worse than losing a match. It meant losing access. The PlayStation 3 had its yellow light of death. The Wii could stop on a black disk read error. Later systems brought blue lights, orange screens, database corruption messages, and error codes like CE348780. But as consoles became permanently connected, their errors became cleaner, corporate, searchable. Something was lost. A modern machine usually tells you an application has closed unexpectedly. An older machine made the room feel colder, and now we can close that open loop, because the internet took this old anxiety and manufactured an entire fake history around it. From roughly 2020 onward, fictional anti-piracy screens exploded across YouTube. Familiar games suddenly accused the player of theft. Characters stared directly at the camera. Distorted music played beneath messages about fines, police, deleted saves, or permanent console bans. Most of these screens were fan-made. Nintendo did not secretly create a horrifying Super Mario 64 prison sequence for pirates. Your childhood copy of Mario Kart DS was not waiting to report you to the authorities. But the videos felt believable because real games had used copy protection, real consoles had displayed cryptic warnings, and we had all seen machines behave in ways we did not understand. The greatest trick of the console era screen was never the color red, the broken audio, or the threatening text. It was making you feel that somewhere beneath the cartridge slot and plastic shell, the CPU, VDP, security ASIC, and unreadable machine code knew something you did not. These screens remain eerie because they sit between two worlds, the warm memory of play and the cold machinery underneath it. Which console era scared you the most, and do you still remember the room where you first saw it? Share your story in the comments, and if you enjoy exploring the strange corners of gaming history with us, leave a like and subscribe. You'll be glad you did.